The phone rang, shattering the silence of the empty house. I picked it up only to hear my father's voice on the other end, cold and unrecognizable. "I'm not your father." The words felt like a slap to my face, but before I could respond, he hung up. I stared at the receiver, heart racing, breath shallow. He couldn't have meant it, could he? Why now? What was he hiding, and why, after all these years, was this the truth he chose to reveal? I can still feel the weight of that moment. It was supposed to be a time of grief, a time to mourn my grandmother, Estelle Montebello, the one person in my family who had ever truly loved me. But instead, it became the moment my entire world shattered. I had just buried her. It had only been a few hours, really, since we laid her to rest, and the weight of her absence felt heavier than any storm I had ever felt. The mansion, her grand home filled with history and legacy, felt empty now. The silence was deafening as though even the house was mourning her loss with me. And then, it happened. I was standing in the grand hallway, my fingers brushing the old oak door, trying to steady myself. The cold autumn air outside seemed distant, even though I could feel its chill trying to creep through the cracks in the walls. But what I felt inside wasn't the wind. It was the coldness in the air as my father, Charles, walked toward me with that look in his eyes. The one that always made me feel like I was never enough. His voice broke the stillness. "You're not my daughter." I froze. The words cut through me like a knife, too sharp, too final. I looked at him, trying to make sense of what I was saying. But there was nothing. No joke. No hint of sarcasm. It was just the cold, hard truth in his eyes that made my stomach drop. "What? What are you talking about?" I barely managed to say, my voice shaky as I tried to hold it together. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after everything. My father's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore." I felt the ground beneath me tilt. I was losing control, my mind racing, trying to process what he was saying. My father had always been distant, always made me feel like I had to earn his approval. But this was different. He wasn't just rejecting me emotionally. He was taking everything I thought was mine, everything I had ever believed was rightfully my inheritance. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I couldn't make sense of this. I had always thought I was his daughter. I had always fought so hard for his approval. Was it all a lie? "Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune," he continued, his voice growing colder. "And you, Lily, you're not one of them." His words echoed in my head, each one more crushing than the last. I couldn't breathe. My grandmother's legacy, the Montebello fortune. It was supposed to be mine. But now, standing there, it felt like it was all slipping away. "Don't play innocent, Lily. You know exactly what I mean." His words sliced through my thoughts like a blade. "I've already spoken to Harrison Mills. Once the lawyer confirms this thing you call your family connection, you'll get nothing. Your grandmother was clear about who was entitled to her estate." I was reeling. The estate. The legacy of my family. The fortune. All of it was suddenly in question. Everything I had ever known was crumbling. And my father, the one person I had tried so hard to please my entire life, was the one tearing it all down. "What? What do you mean? Confirm?" I finally managed to ask, my voice thin and barely a whisper. It was as if the words had left me, all my strength drained by his rejection. "I'm your daughter, Charles. How can you say this?" He smiled, but it wasn't kind. It wasn't even a smile. It was something more malicious. "No, you're not." His voice was hard, final, like the slamming of a door. "I've seen the results. You're not mine. And when the lawyer confirms what we already know, there'll be nothing left for you." I felt as though the world was closing in on me. The will to we, my grandmother's will, the one that had always included me, the one that was supposed to pass on her fortune, now seemed like something out of a nightmare. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. Looked at him, standing there in front of me, his face the same cold mask of authority it always was. But a day, It was worse. Today, I wasn't just the daughter trying to gain his approval. Today, I was someone he was disowning. The very core of my identity was under attack. I don't understand. The words slipped from my lips, barely audible. You've always told me I was your daughter, he laughed bitterly. I've tolerated you for years, Lily, but your presence, your existence, was always a reminder that I couldn't have the perfect family. His voice dropped lower, colder, and his eyes were icy with a hatred I had never seen before. But now it's time to end this. You're not my daughter, not by blood, and no matter what your grandmother thought, I won't let you take what's mine. His words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't even think. It was as if my whole world was being dismantled, piece by piece. My grandmother had always treated me like family, like I belonged in this house, in this world. But now it was clear that she was gone. And, with her, any protection I thought I had. You're wrong, Charles. I will be there for the reading of the will. Grandmother wanted me there. My voice was shaky, but I found a strength I hadn't known I had. I wasn't going to back down. Not yet, he sneered at me, turning to leave. You can attend if you must, but don't expect anything. I've already spoken to Harrison about challenging anything that includes you. The finality in his tone was deafening. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the fortune. It was about erasing me from everything I had ever known, everything I had ever worked for. I couldn't let him do that. I stood there, my heart beating painfully in my chest. This wasn't over. I would find a way to fight back. I didn't know how yet, but I would. I wasn't going to let him rewrite my history. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the hallway, before I snapped out of the fog of disbelief. The world was still spinning, my father's words echoing, in my mind, as if they were etched into the very walls of that house. I thought I'd known who I was, what I was entitled to, but in a matter of minutes, my entire life had been thrown into chaos. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, the worst was that I had to face my mother. Next, I didn't want to believe what my father had said. I didn't want to accept that he wasn't my real father, or that somehow my grandmother had been wrong in her will. But a small part of me, buried deep beneath the hurt and confusion, knew I needed answers. The truth, however painful, had to come out. I texted my mother immediately. Her response was brief but pointed. We need to talk tonight. Alone. As soon as I saw those words, a chill ran down my spine. What was she hiding? We met at a small cafe in town. It was her favorite. A quiet place tucked away from the chaos of the city. The kind of place where you could pretend to be just another ordinary person, not tied to the family that had always felt larger than life. She was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. There were dark circles under her eyes, a sign of the sleepless nights she'd clearly endured since my grandmother's death. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of the unspoken words between us, the tension thick enough to choke on. She didn't speak at first, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee cup, her eyes avoiding mine. I knew something was coming. I had to be ready. Finally, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. I never wanted you to find out like this. Her voice was quiet but strained, almost as though she was apologizing for something she couldn't take back. What Charles said, it's true. He's not your biological father. I felt the breath leave my body in a rush. It was like the floor had just dropped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew, everything I had built my sense of self around, was gone. I wasn't Charles's daughter. But even as the words sunk in, a question burned in my mind. If not Charles, then who? I managed to speak, my voice shaking. So who is? The words sounded hollow, like I was asking her to shatter whatever remained of my sense of security. But I had to know. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling. It's complicated, Lily. She swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. Before I met Charles, I was in love with someone else. Your uncle, Victor. I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. Uncle Victor? I had always known him as the quiet, distant figure in our family, the one who'd left for Seattle years ago to pursue his medical research, who only visited for major family events. I never knew much about him, certainly nothing about a past with my mother. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean, you were in love with him? My mother's eyes flickered with a pain I hadn't expected. Victor and I, we were young, Lily. We had plans. We thought we'd make it work, even with the distance. But when he went to Seattle, things changed. We tried, but we couldn't hold on. And that's when I met Charles. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me again. My own mother, the woman who had raised me, had been in love with someone else. And somehow, I was the result of that love. The love she'd abandoned for Charles. She paused for a moment, and I could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of years spent hiding this truth from me. I never told you this because I didn't want to hurt you, but when I found out I was pregnant, I thought Victor was the father. The timing, it fit perfectly. He had just visited. I felt sick to my stomach. If Victor was my biological father, then what did that mean for my entire life? For me place in the Montebello family? And why hadn't my mother told me this sooner? She continued, her voice growing more fragile. But Charles, he insisted. The child was his. Victor was already engaged to someone else, and I didn't want to disrupt his life. So when Charles proposed, I accepted. I needed stability for the baby. For you. I could hardly breathe. My mother's decision, her sacrifice, everything she had kept hidden from me, it was like an enormous weight pressing down on my chest. I thought I was doing the right thing, Lily, but I wasn't. Her voice cracked, and I could see the tear spooling in her eyes now. I never wanted to hurt you, but I didn't know what else to do. I had to protect you. I was reeling. My whole life had been based on the idea that Charles was my father, and now everything was unraveling. If Victor was my biological father, it meant that I wasn't even a Montebello by birth, despite my grandmother's will. So, what does this mean? I asked quietly, my heart heavy with the weight of all this new information. Why is this coming out now? Why did Charles say all this about me? My mother took another deep breath, her hand shaking. It's because of your grandmother's will. Lily. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of everything that had been hidden for so long. Charles is worried. He thinks your grandmother might have left you a significant portion of the fortune. He's terrified that you'll get something, anything, and he's trying to discredit your claim. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My father had known. He had always known, and now he was using his power, his influence, to erase me from the family legacy. But what could I do? If I wasn't a Blackwell Hollier by blood, would I be able to fight for the inheritance? I could barely wrap my head around it, but one thing was clear. Charles had just opened a door I wasn't sure I could close. After talking to my mother, everything seemed to blur together. The world outside that cafe window looked the same, but it felt like everything inside me had changed. I couldn't stop thinking about the implications of what she had just revealed. Victor. My uncle, the man who had always been a distant, quiet figure in our family, the one who had left for Seattle years ago and only returned for rare family gatherings. And now, according to my mother, he was my biological father. I didn't know how to process it. I spent the rest of the night pacing in my apartment, the images of my mother's confession spinning in my head like a broken record. She hadn't meant to hurt me, I knew that. She had made the best choice she could at the time. But that didn't change the fact that I was living a lie I had never even suspected. What did this mean for my place in the Montebello legacy? Would I still have a claim to my grandmother's fortune if I wasn't a biological Blackwell? Would the trust see me as a legitimate heir, or was I now just a person adrift, cut off from everything I had ever known. I had no answers, only questions. And so, I did the only thing I could think of. I called Victor. I wasn't sure what I expected. He'd always been so removed from the family, always so focused on his research and his life in Seattle. But I needed to know. I needed him to tell me the truth. Was I his daughter? It felt surreal dialing his number, but when he picked up, his voice sounded warm, familiar, even though we hadn't spoken in years. "Lily?" he said, as if he'd been expecting my call. "What's going on?" I tried to find my voice. It was harder than I thought. How do you ask someone if they're your biological father? How do you make sense of something that was never supposed to be a question? Uncle Victor, I hesitated, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I need to know something, and I need you to be honest with me. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could practically hear him processing my words. Then, in a quiet tone, he said, "Go on." I took a deep breath. Were you ever involved with my mother before she married Charles?" Victor didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick with unspoken things. Finally, he sighed. Yes. His admission hit me like a freight train. I wasn't prepared for it, even though I had already suspected something like this. It felt like the entire foundation of my life had been tilted on its axis. The answer was simple, but the consequences of that answer were anything but. What happened? Why didn't you ever tell me? The words spilled out before I could stop them. Victor's voice softened. We were young, Lily. He paused, and I could hear the weight of his words. We were in love, but life. It has a way of getting in the way. I left for Seattle for that research opportunity, and your mother, well, she stayed behind. Things started to fall apart. I sat down, my head spinning. He was speaking so calmly, like this was a memory that had long since been put to rest. But for me, this was everything. This was the truth I had never known, the thing that had been subconsciously kept from me for 27 years. But I swallowed, forcing the words out. But why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you ever say anything? Victor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick, with emotion. I never knew you were mine, Lily. He sighed, the sound so sad, so burdened with years of regret. Your mother never told me. I didn't know she was pregnant until long after she married Charles. By the time I found out, things were already complicated. She had made her choice, and I didn't want to disrupt her life anymore. I felt a rush of anger, then confusion, swirling inside me. Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't I known the truth? But I pushed those thoughts aside, focused on the one thing that mattered right now. So you're telling me I'm really your daughter? My voice trembled, barely able to contain the enormity of the question. Victor's response was slow, but sure. Yes. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the truth settle on me. Victor was my father. The realization was almost too much to bear. For 27 years, I had believed Charles was my father, that I was part of the Montebello family, that I had a place in the legacy of the wealth and power they had built. But now I wasn't even sure where I belonged. What does this mean? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What do I do now? Victor sighed again, but this time there was a sense of resolve in his voice. You do what you need to do, Lily. He paused, as if searching for the right words. You find out what your grandmother wanted, and if that means standing up to Charles, then you do that. It's time to claim what's yours. The finality in his words stirred something in me. It wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about truth. And if there was one thing I knew about myself now, it was that I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me. Not Charles, not anyone. I had to find out what my grandmother had left me, and I had to make sure that the Montebello legacy didn't slip through my fingers, no matter who was trying to stop me. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping out of my control. My world had just been upended by secrets I hadn't known existed. But I couldn't afford to be overwhelmed, not when I was about to face Charles Onus in the battle for my grandmother's inheritance. After my conversation with Victor, I knew one thing for sure. I needed proof. If I was going to stand a chance, I needed hard evidence that I was indeed Victor's daughter and not Charles's, a DNA test. It was the only way to settle this. I called Victor the next morning, and within hours, we had a plan. We arranged for an expedited DNA test through a private lab, results within 72 hours, just enough time to have the evidence before the white will reading. It was a simple step, yet it felt monumental. As the lab technician collected our samples, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. What would the results reveal? Would I finally have the leverage I needed to confront Charles? The anticipation was suffocating, but I knew there was no turning back now. The next 2 days felt like an eternity. Every moment was filled with tension. Every noise seemed amplified, and all I could think about was the DNA test results. Would they be the key to everything? Or would they turn out to be just another disappointment in a life full of them? I couldn't sit still. I checked my phone constantly, half expecting a message from Victor or the lab, but there was nothing. The silence was maddening. I had to prepare for the will reading, but I couldn't stop, wondering if I'd even have a chance once I walked into that room. Charles was ruthless. He had already set the stage, presenting his own false evidence, telling everyone I wasn't really his daughter. But with the DNA test, I would have proof, not just for the will reading, but for everything. The truth would finally come out. But as the day of the reading drew closer, the reality of what I was about to face settled in. My father's influence was vast, and he wasn't going to let go of the Montebello fortune without a fight. The stakes had never been higher, and I knew I couldn't afford to lose. I was ready. Or at least, I had to be. The day of the will reading arrived far too quickly. I barely slept the night before, my mind spinning with all the possibilities, all the scenarios I had played out in my head. When I walked into my grandmother's study, I was surprised by how empty it felt. The large table was set for the family, but there was a coldness in the air, an eerie stillness that made the grand room feel smaller than it should have. Charles was already seated, looking confident and smug, as if the fight had already been won. My brothers, Thomas and William, sat on either side of him, their expressions unreadable. I could almost feel the weight of their unspoken thoughts. They didn't know everything yet, but they would soon. The attorney, Harrison Mills, stood at the head of the table. He gave me a quick nod, but I could see the tension in his eyes as he turned toward the stack of documents before him. The room fell silent, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Before we begin, I must address a delicate matter regarding eligibility for inheritance, Harrison said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. Some beneficiaries may not qualify under the terms of the Blackwell Trust. Charles straightened in his chair, giving me a triumphant glance. I could feel his satisfaction radiating off him as he leaned forward, ready to make his claim. It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Eleanor Blackwell's will may not qualify under the bloodline provisions of the original Blackwell Family Trust, Harrison continued, his eyes now fixed on me. I could feel Charles's gaze boring into me. He was ready. He had prepared for this moment, and he was going to make sure I was excluded. The whole room was waiting for him to speak, to make his case that I wasn't really his daughter, and that I didn't deserve any part of the inheritance. Jennifer Blackwell is not my biological daughter, Charles said, his voice cold and sure. Therefore, she's no claim to the Blackwell fortune. His words stung, but I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to let him erase me, not after everything I had been through. I slowly stood up, taking a deep breath. That's not true, I said, my voice steady but fierce. I pulled out the DNA results from my bag, placing them on the table for everyone to see. This proves I'm Victor Blackwell's daughter, not Charles's. The room went dead silent. Charles's face drained of color, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. His whole plan, the foundation of his argument, was falling apart in front of him. "This changes nothing," he said through clenched teeth, his voice laced with desperation. "The trust was written for descendants of the Blackwell bloodline. It's about who's truly a Blackwell." I couldn't help but smile. This was my moment. "Actually, I believe you're forgetting something, Charles," I said, my voice steady but filled with a quiet satisfaction. "Your mother, my grandmother, had a clause in her will stating that only direct descendants of her father, Harold Blackwell, would inherit. And you're not even his biological son." The room was completely still as everyone processed the new revelation. Charles wasn't even a Blackwell by blood. His claim to the family fortune had been based on a lie. He had no right to deny me what my grandmother had wanted for me. "What are you talking about?" Charles stammered, his voice faltering for the first time. "That's ridiculous." I stood taller now, my confidence growing with each passing second. "It's true, Charles. You were adopted into the Blackwell family as an infant. That means you're not a Blackwell by blood. And that makes you ineligible for the inheritance you've been so desperate to protect." The silence in the room was thick with disbelief. Charles's face was a mixture of shock and rage, but I could see his carefully constructed world unraveling. Before him, "You can't be serious," Charles muttered, his eyes flicking from me to my brothers who were staring at him in stunned silence. My heart pounded in my chest as the reality of what was happening set in. I had the proof. My grandmother's legacy, her family fortune, was now within my grasp. And Charles's empire was crumbling. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. For the first time, Charles seemed completely undone, his carefully curated facade of control cracking under the weight of his own lies. He shot an angry glance at me, but the smugness was gone from his face. "This is absurd," he muttered, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "You're twisting everything to fit your narrative. This doesn't change anything." I felt my heart race as I stood my ground. The fear that had plagued me since I first discovered my true lineage was starting to fade. I was right. The truth was finally coming to light, and there was no way Charles could deny it anymore. "I'm not twisting anything, Charles." My voice was steady now, confident. "You've been playing this game for so long, but it's over. You're not a Blackwell by blood, and you know it. Everything you've been fighting to keep. You don't even have the right to it." Harrison, who had been watching the exchange with a calculated neutrality, cleared his throat. "It's true," he said quietly, shifting through the documents in front of him. "Charles Blackwell's adoption records are in the Blackwell family archives. His eligibility for the trust was never questioned, but in light of the current revelations..." He trailed off, looking at Charles with a mixture of skepticism and pity. For the first time in years, I saw a crack in Harrison's composure. He wasn't defending Charles anymore. Charles's face flushed with rage. "You think this will change the fact that Eleanor's will was written for legitimate heirs?" His voice rose, filled with desperation. "It doesn't matter who my real parents were." "It does matter," I interrupted, cutting him off. My pulse was pounding, but I couldn't let him regain control of the room. "Because if we're applying this strict bloodline rule you've been so adamant about, then by your own logic, you're disqualified." There was a stunned silence. It wasn't just Charles who was reeling. It was everyone in the room. 4 years, the Blackwell family had operated on the belief that only direct descendants of Harold Blackwell could inherit, and now the rules were being rewritten in real time. But just as the realization started to sink in, the door opened, and Bernard Walsh, my grandmother's personal lawyer, entered the room. He was frail, leaning heavily on a cane, but his presence immediately commanded attention. "I'm sorry I'm late, everyone," he said with a small smile, taking his seat at the head of the table. Heisais immediately found me, and I could tell by the subtle nod he gave me that he knew exactly what was happening. Charles's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he demanded, his tone harsh. "You can't just waltz in here and change everything." Bernardo looked at him calmly, his glasses perched on his nose. "Actually, Charles, I'm here because your grandmother's wishes. need to be honored, despite the confusion in this room. He opened a folder and slid it across the table to Harrison. Eleanor knew there might be questions about bloodlines, which is why she arranged for a letter to be read if any issues arose with the will. Bernard's voice was steady, and for the first time, I felt like we were finally on the path to justice. Harrison took the letter, hesitated, and then began reading aloud, his voice carrying in the silent room. To my family, if this letter is being read, then the questions regarding the bloodline of my heirs have come to light. I have known for some time that Charles was not my biological son. This was a decision I made out of love and necessity. But as my wealth has grown, I realize that what matters more than blood is loyalty to the family legacy. I also knew, from the moment I held my granddaughter, Lily, that she was meant to be part of this legacy, regardless of who her biological father is. The truth, as painful as it may be, is that Victor Blackwell is Lily's true father, and she is as much a part of the Montebello family as anyone else. I have restructured my estate to reflect these facts, as I believe blood is not the sole measure of worth or family. The trust will be divided, but my personal assets will pass to Lily and Victor, as they are my true heirs by blood and by spirit. I ask that you, my family, accept this truth and move forward with love, not greed. With love, Eleanor Montebello. As Bernard finished reading, the room was completely still. The tension was palpable, but there was also something else. Relief. Charles looked like he had been punched in the stomach. His face was pale, his mouth working betoonable to form words. I could hardly believe it. My grandmother had known everything. She had arranged for this moment long before Charles had ever tried to push me out of the family. She had made sure I would be protected, that I would have a claim to the inheritance no matter what. I glanced at Victor, who sat across from me, his eyes filled with a mix of awe and sadness. It was clear we had both lost so much time, but now we were finally stepping into the light of truth together. Charles stood abruptly, knocking his chair over in the process. "This is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't just rewrite history." But there was no more authority in his voice, only desperation. "It's over, Charles," I said, standing up slowly. My heart was racing, but this time it wasn't with fear. "You've lost." And with that, the room fell into a deep silence. The game was over. Charles didn't stay much longer after Bernard's reading. The look in his eyes was enough to know he'd nothing left to say. He had lost, not just the fortune, but his sense of control, his grip on the family's future. His legacy, built on power and manipulation, had crumbled beneath the weight of truth. The rest of the family, my brothers included, were quiet. They hadn't expected the truth to hit so hard. I could see the conflict in their eyes, shock, confusion, and perhaps a bit of relief. Victor stood beside me, and for the first time, he felt like my real family. His presence, steady and calm, was the anchor I had needed all along. "You're not alone anymore, Lily." His voice was soft but filled with conviction, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. I turned to face him, my heart full of emotions I hadn't known how to name until now. Family wasn't just about bloodlines or names. It was about trust, connection, and love. And for the first time, I felt like I belonged. My gaze shifted to my mother, who had stayed quiet through the ordeal, but I could see the relief in her eyes. She had carried this secret for so long, and now, finally, it was out in the open. We could move forward together. "I'm sorry I kept this from you, Lily," my mother whispered, stepping toward me. "I thought I was protecting you, but in truth I was only keeping you from knowing who you truly are." I nodded, a weight lifting off my chest. "I understand now, Mom. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way we could move forward." As the room emptied, leaving just Victor, my mother, and me, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I looked at the documents my grandmother had prepared. Everything she had planned, all her careful decisions, were finally taking shape. I walked over to the desk where the final provisions of the will were laid out. The Montebello fortune would be passed on, but not in the way Charles had imagined. My grandmother had restructured everything with us in mind, Victor and me, ensuring that we would carry on the legacy with integrity, and most importantly, with love. "We've lost so much time," I said softly, almost to myself. "But maybe we can build something better now." Victor smiled, his expression echoing the same sentiment. Maybe we can. We weren't heirs to the Blackwell fortune or to a name that had held power for generations. But we were heirs to something much more valuable, a family that was finally united, a history that was finally reclaimed, and a future that was full of possibility. As we walked out of the mansion, the sun had begun to set, casting a warm glow over the old estate. The world outside felt new, like we had just stepped into a new chapter, one where the past no longer had control over us. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. The truth had come to light, not only about who I was, but about what mattered most: love, loyalty, and the strength to stand up for what's right. The Montebello legacy wasn't about fortune or bloodlines anymore. It was about the future we would build, the family we had become. And for the first time, I was exactly where I was meant to be.